Greetings once again to those of you who listen or watch on YouTube. And again, good morning to all of you who are here with me. And greetings also to any of you who might be watching on our closed circuit live stream from other areas around campus. It is such a privilege to be here. And this morning is wildly beautiful weather. And in case you can't tell, I was sitting in the sun yesterday and struggling to figure out how to pull all of my crazy thoughts around a single topic into a brief address. So the topics for today's chapel is service or servanthood. And it's one of a number of topics that come for me in rotation. I am quite fond of it, and it's an essential in addiction recovery, especially in a 12-step frame. One of the things that I thought I would want to talk about is a memory that came strongly back to me, which is being a child in a Roman Catholic observant family. Being in the church, sitting in the pew with my mom and dad and my siblings, and when it was time for the morning offering, one of my parents would open the pocketbook or the wallet, and they would take out some, usually singles. I don't remember. I think I was not yet aware enough to track what a $5 bill was versus a $1 bill. But anyway, my guess is that since there were 5 of us, there were $1 bills. And when the basket came, each child was supposed to put money in the basket. And I remember doing this in a kinesthetic and physical way, and I remember the setting of the church, and I don't have a lot of that kind of detailed memory from my young childhood, but it's interesting to me that sticks, because this is one of the things that I want to propose, is that I think servanthood is a value. Alms giving is a form of servanthood. And that's an old-fashioned word. If you don't know what alms to the poor, I remember hearing that. And I think we've sort of lost the word. But the notion of charity through the congregational entities, synagogue or mosque or church or mass, worship service or whatever, is a form of almsgiving that is an enactment of service to your neighbor and those who are in worse suffering than perhaps you. And so it's a cultural value that comes through a wisdom tradition. And Christianity holds no proprietary hold on charity and almsgiving as a part of its practice. And then, in fact, if you take a look across the wisdom traditions, you find servanthood as an imperative in Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, Hinduism. And I did look at those various traditions to sort of see how they express this service imperative. And I would guess because it's so strongly evident in those 5 traditions that I just mentioned, that if there were other traditions, you would look and you would see it as well. The theorists around this peculiar decision of a person to act in the interest of another rather than themselves have a bunch of words to this. One is pro-social behavior. So pro-social behavior is observed by psychologists and behaviorists as sort of defining a mammalian trait against reptiles, which, let's say, eat their young. And it seems like the close communities where this manifests in an anthropological and evolutionary sense. So, not to remind us all that we're great apes, but we are. And we don't even, not only do no religious tradition hold sort of ownership of the notion of service to others, but in fact you see this in lesser animals. And one of the places I know it comes out is in a thing I observe in my wife, who I adore, and she is in her very center a mother. And yesterday we were on the beach, and there were these 2 bleached kids, 5 years old, coming up, Miss Judy, because my wife is a preschool teacher. And these kids recognized their preschool teacher, over the beach. And over the course of the hours that we sat there, they kept coming up and trying to draw her into play. And she's like, I'm just going to sit here and read my book, kids. And they're like, you've been here all day. But the reason I don't need to tell you whole day beach stories, but the reason I say this is that my wife manifests a capacity to make connections with these little beings. And she also has 2 grown boys. And if anyone were to threaten those boys, even with some pejorative comment, she can tell terrible things about her boys, but let anybody else and the daggers will fly. And it's that protective mama bear thing that is, if you think of that as protecting one's own, yes it is, but that's where this notion of service evolves in us, is that we recognize that we have to protect the vulnerable, at least within our own immediate family, in order for the whole family to survive. One of the things I learned in moral development was that those of us who experience the role of parenting, whether or not we experience it biologically, but if you just have that experience of being parental, what sort of defines it is the willingness to take the bullet for the child. And if you have not had that experience, there are developmental and evolutionary theorists who say that you've missed a stage of human development. And that once you have had that, and this often happens for people that are struck in the birth of an infant into their lives, that going home from the hospital, they realize that they're experiencing this visceral, vital care for this other being. And that all of a sudden it reorients all their priorities and values, and now I'm all about this dependent, needy, vulnerable, beautiful, screaming, wordless, can't even control its bowels kind of thing. And it's mine, and it's an expression of who I am, and suddenly my whole life is about this person and not just about me. Now, of course, it's a stretch from that to the alms in the basket, paying for an offering that's going to some remote area. To sort of stay on track, but I'm going to just trust that this message will get to where it needs to go. One of the most difficult moments for me in my life of service, I'm a recovering addict, and I am a person who was accused in my addiction, very typical, of incredible selfishness. People told me, you are such a selfish SOB because of the drinking and drugs, right? And I remember those accusations landing in a way that didn't feel congruent with my self-concept. Because I didn't want to be a selfish person. The little boy that was putting the dollars in the basket grew up with these deep values of love and community and service, and thinking of himself as a nice person. But it is true, my behavior was experienced by others as incredibly selfish. Let's say it in a better way, self-centered. And then in my sobriety, I followed AA's call to become a person of service. And it started in very, very practical ways. I've been sober long enough that at the meetings that I started going to, there were smokers. And one of the service roles that you had in your early AA life was to clean out ashtrays after a meeting. Really kind of grungy, gross work, but I was a smoker, so I knew what ashtrays were like. And I remember cleaning up ashtrays in the sink behind the meeting that was my home group. And then there were these other things like greeting and setting up coffee. One of my favorite commitments, they call these things commitments in service relations, was making coffee at the West Side Club in Washington, D.C., well into my sobriety. And they had like a pretty fancy coffee shop. So West Side Club was a clubhouse for AA meetings, morning, afternoon, and evening. And I did the 7 a.m. meeting on Tuesdays, coffee. So I'd get there at 6 a.m., start the coffee pots, and I would get to have this chance to like greet and intersect with people. And there was that feeling of benevolence of having done something for the tribe, and it was part of my sobriety. I'm headed to somewhere. So one of the like horrible awakenings of my service life was previous to the coffee commitment at the West Side Club, being in Africa. I had done international service work in Jamaica, Haiti, and in Africa on brief mission trips, which were typical of churches. Churches still often do this, especially Christian churches, organize these things. Go to some remote site, and it's like a Doctors Without Borders, which is a great organization, and I'm not trying to take that organization down, but But when a local church or a group of local churches in 2007 organized a team that I led to go into the DRC in the Congo in Africa to do cataract surgeries and bring solar power to a remote setting for a hospital that had lost electricity, which sounds amazing. I mean, it was an amazing experience. It was wonderful. But I'm there in this remote village, and like most of their healthy males had been wiped out in civil war, and I mean, it was just a grim situation. But the people that were there to work with us conveyed to me, in a variety of ways, their disdain for white, wealthy Americans spending thousands and thousands of dollars to come into their community and be these heroic beings that brought sight to the blind and power to the hospital, and then, bye, hope you do well. One very, very passionate, intelligent, wonderful young pastor said to me, you know, we kind of wish you would trust us and just send us the frickin' money. And it made my heart hurt. In my engagement with this topic over now several years, one of my dear friends has suggested I think about the word altruism. And I thought about that word this week, and I did some research around it. And altruism and servanthood are surely closely connected, right? This is the behavior of people in the interest. I always thought true was the root, but it's not. Alter is where altruism comes from. It's otherism as opposed to egoism. So altruism is when a being orients itself towards the benefit, the wellness of another at its own cost or sacrifice. And I'm going to get so lost here. The conundrum there is, well, if you draw something from altruism, like it makes you feel better, it helps you stay sober, then it's not really in the interest of the other, because it's in the interest of yourself. And this is what is called, in the research, enlightened self-interest. And I don't think it detracts from the altruistic aspect of servanthood. It's just true. Like, we find intrinsic benefit from being of love and service to others. If you have never done it, which is probably impossible, but you may have lost the feeling of how wonderful it is to orient your life to the other rather than to yourself. You may have. Addiction does that. Addiction has come to be understood better in the last 10, 15 years than it had ever been, I believe, in human history, because of neuroscience, psychological improvements, and lots of money and resources being thrown at this problem. And at the same time, I think addiction is getting more and more prevalent. I think the major mental health crises that we have today with depression, anxiety, and obsessive disorders are, some think, a counter manifestation of the addictive problems of our screen addictions and our compulsivity disorders, not even with drugs and alcohol. And there's lots of really good research that suggests, we see this all the time. In 28 days of abstinence from substances, people who come in terribly depressed at the beginning are less depressed at the end. And it turns out their depression is not depression per se, it's depression that's a consequence of substance use disorder. Because being an addict is freaking depressing. That's I just decided to use that word, so I need to be careful. But the most insightful way I know to try and convey to people what's happening in an addictive disorder, because addictions are confusing, right? And in the room here today, we always have individuals who have a use disorder and individuals who are here because they love them, and then alumni and staff and other people who are sort of somehow attached to this train. But the central audience of these messages is always either persons who are addicted or people who are in relationship to people who are addicted. And the best way of understanding what happens to the person who's wearing the wristband in the room, patient, is that their attachment chemistry, their ability to bond, like I was talking about a mom with an infant, that's our bonding apparatus, has become misappropriated by these behaviors. And this is why people will ferociously hurt others for the sake of their next high. And why the people who are around them are like, you are such a selfish jerk. And because there is an expectation on the part of people in covenant relationship of mutuality. We expect our loved ones to show up and suit up and participate in cleaning ashtrays or washing dishes or whatever. And all of a sudden what's happened is that this person in our little unit has stopped participating in the covenantal mutuality of the give and take of our lives. And what they are giving and taking to is the bottle or the needle or the escort service or the gambling app or the Amazon Prime Day, I'm guilty, and it's so prevalent that I think it's almost fair to say not whether you are addicted or not, but in what way this is catching you. I just was listening to a piece on this while I was doing all my research this week that talks about how in societies with our level of affluence and above, happiness 50 years ago was correlated with living in a privileged and a society where at least you had a roof over your head and you had, but happiness is decreasing in our culture right now. And I think it's because of this unbelievable proliferation of dopamine upregulation where everybody's getting high all the time on something. And when you're getting high on high, the brain compensates by lowering its sort of median state when it's not high to try and balance the ship out. And that means that when we're not high, we're depressed. And so then we need more. It's this miserable state. And what I was saying is that the person who is addicted is yoked, trapped, given over, that's a good way of saying it, given over into this compulsivity, the behavioral disorder, whatever it is. It could be alcohol, it could be drug, but it could be any one of these behavioral things, sex, gambling, shopping, internet gaming. And that relationship, it is a relationship. I hate to call it a relationship because it's such a sucky relationship, but it is using our relationship capacity to hold us hostage. And that's why it's so hard to break an addiction, is because it's the very most powerful thing in us, is this attachment chemistry. And we are evolved to do this to something or someone, but when we do it to something, we do it at the expense of the capacity to be able to then be connected to someone. And the antidote to this is to cultivate and experience human connectedness again. We must find our way back to love. We must get our nose out of the screen or the mirror or the whatever and begin to connect to other beings of our species. Some people do it one of the things I see often with people in early recovery is they get out of treatment and they continue to struggle with forming these bonds, and then they get a dog or a cat, which is to some degree great if it's a training wheels thing to back to humans. But unfortunately, the power of the dog connection is super strong and it seems sufficient. And then that person is missing this unbelievable richness. How is it that AA can promise happy, joyous, and free? That's what the 12 steps hold out as the fruit of the journey of recovery. And they are not wrong. They are correct in offering you this hope that your shackles being torn away and you're following the path that's on the wall there, you will begin to experience authentic human connectedness, and that will make you happier and more fulfilled than you have ever any hope of being with dope in your arm, or alcohol in your belly, or the screen as your keeper, or whatever it is. So I felt excited when all of a sudden this hit me about Thursday. I'm like, this is where the service imperative in AA comes from, is that it's telling me as a newcomer in recovery to connect to somebody else, to do anything for somebody else, to clean an ashtray, Because what is in the encoded wisdom of that tradition is that I have lost those practices. I have forgotten to put $1 in the basket. I have forgotten that that's how we are meant to be. I have forgotten that we is more important than me. One of the theologians and philosophers that really brought a powerful shift in the 20th century was a guy named Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher and theologian. And his signature work, I think, is 3 words, I and thou. In any case, I and thou, or maybe I, thou. But Buber's work attacked philosophy in the 19th to 20th century for becoming terribly self-absorbed by talking about the nature of the self, and does the self exist, and what is being, and what is becoming. I don't know if you're like Heidegger or Kant literate or whatever, but it gets really deep in these holes of like, what is the nature of my existence? And Martin Buber says the nature of my existence is most profoundly experienced when I connect to another being. How can I dispute my existence if I see you seeing me see you? This is the visceral engagement in the nature of what it is to be an organism that can be aware of the other organisms around it. And it's sacred and powerful and beautiful. And sadly, the one person I wanted to most connect with 34 years ago was the person who had alcohol or drugs. And once I had it, wow, my chemistry of attachment was diverted into the activity of like, drinking from the hose rather than being able to be in the nurturance of this mutuality of give and take that will make me and the other person thrive. So, people are like, I don't want to be a service person. You do. You actually do. And you will find joy and meaning in it, maybe not at the beginning. There's this paradox of the initial sacrifice that has to be endured. It's the discomfort of the addict without their pleasure. But what I need to finish up here with is to ask you, who will you serve? It's a tough question until you realize it's not whether you will serve. You're serving right now. You're serving something as your master. You're either serving your addictive power, or what about the notion of you being a being that is called into being to love? And if you can hear that as an invitation and awaken to it, then there's just this proliferation of contexts in which you can serve. And can you go to Africa and bring sight to the blind? You can. That's probably the most ineffective use of resources to get the service benefits that accrue in this term. But right here, right now, and in your very communities, in your family, there are people that are in need. And little things like holding doors, all these little gestures that we have, and courtesies and all those sorts of manners are derived from this sort of inherent wisdom that was there in our politeness in communities thousands of years that taught us that it was this that holds us together. It's this that keeps us alive. It's this that makes us thrive, is to be in relationship with one another. And there are consummate examples of altruism. I almost did the whole message about Father Bill Holbrook. Those of you who ever met him, that was a dude who inherently got this. He lived a life of service, and he was one of the most weirdly happy dudes I've ever known. Not for any good reason, but just because he just exhibited this ebullient enthusiasm. And I know it was fueled by his dedication to the other. And I used to think I'll never get there, but we can all move in that direction. And it requires us wrestling ourselves away from the unhealthy and non-life-giving attachments that include the screens, or for the family member may include the addict themselves. You may be just as addicted to trying to wrestle your addict out of addiction as the addict is addicted to the substance or behavior themselves. Which, of course, you'd say, well, that's a loving act. It is, to a point, but share the wealth in that case. Like, the medicine of recovery has come to be understood today only in the last 5 to 10 years in such a powerful way that current researchers are now saying mutual support is the single most reliable and effective medicine, better than professional therapy. Addicts will get better from participating in mutual support communities than they will just in therapy alone. That's a powerful message. So I feel like I've wandered all over the place. I surely have. I really appreciate everybody's attention. We have other stuff to get to. Let's enjoy the rest of the service, and let's love one another as God has loved us. Thanks so much.